Hi everyone, my name is Dora Eloise Anadera, and for my final project, I chose to focus on the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case from 1831. This case in particular stood out to me amongst all my other options because I felt like it really exposed how our Constitution, while it was meant to protect the justice and rights of its people, didn't always live up to that fact. And we can especially see how this played out for Native communities. So today we're going to go ahead and talk about what happened within the case, how it connects to race, power, and also why it still matters today. For starters, let's go ahead and talk about the importance of the case. So, in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, it really shows us how our Constitution sounds really good on paper, but it doesn't actually protect everyone like it promises in writing. It talks a lot about justices and rights, but when it comes to Native nations such as the Cherokee, those promises got ignored, and we can see how that relates when we talk about the judicial system and the case itself. This is very important because it's a clear example of how law can be used to leave people and communities out, especially when power and race are involved. But it's also important because this is a case that impacted many generations of communities. Let's go ahead and provide some historical background within the case. So in the late 1820s, Georgia passed a bunch of laws that wiped out the Cherokee Nation's rights as communities. But instead of giving up, the Cherokee used the U.S. legal system to try and protect themselves, which was something they were allowed to do as people within America. They went to the Supreme Court and said that under Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, that they were a foreign nation, which would mean that they had the given right to sue Georgia for violating treaties. And as stated in the Federal Judicial Center article, they were trying to stop Georgia from kicking them off of their own native land, and they based their case on treaties that they had with the U.S. itself. They were literally using the Constitution the way it was meant to be used, which was to defend their human rights. That fact leads us to the Supreme Court's ruling of the case, and more so the Supreme Court's decision. So the court was led by Chief Justice John Marshall, and he said that the Cherokee weren't a foreign nation, and instead he called them a domestic dependent nation, and ruled within the court that they had no jurisdiction, which led to the case getting dismissed. As explained in the Supreme Justia article, this decision basically told the Cherokee that even though they had treaties and were promised protection, that they couldn't use the Supreme Courts to defend themselves. It shows us just how institutions like the Supreme Court can just block the ideas of justice depending on who you were and what you were asking for at the time. More so, Marshall also said that the Cherokee's relation to the United States resembles that of a ward to his guardian. And as mentioned in the Supreme Justia article, that quote says everything that we need to know about how the judicial system viewed nations that were native at the time. The courts didn't see native nations as equals. They saw them as children who needed to be controlled and wave the idea of justice within their face and pick and chose when they wanted to present justice to them and when they did not. This is when the Cherokee Nation knew that it wasn't just about law. It was about stripping them of power and treating them as less than. And the Constitution that was supposed to protect them was just used to justify taking their independence as a nation away. There's a lot of opposing views from Marshall's point, but the one that sparked the most outcome out of it was Justice Thompson, who completely disagreed with the majority of the ruling within the case. He said that the Cherokee should absolutely be considered a foreign nation, and he even pointed out that they had their own government, their own laws, and that the U.S. did sign multiple treaties with them just like any other foreign country. As mentioned in the Suprema Justina article, he said, "It is not perceived how it is possible to escape the conclusion that they form a sovereign state." Thompson was basically saying, if the U.S. treated them like a nation in every other way, how can the court now act like they didn't, and that they weren't a nation? That goes ahead and leads us to what this case was really about. And the answer to that was race and power. Now let's go ahead and talk about how this is just bigger than just a court case within the room. So we know that this case wasn't just about words within the Constitution. It was about land, gold, and power. And as the Cherokee Nation's own article explains, Georgia wanted Cherokee land because there was gold on it, simply because there was profit to make of the land that the natives were living on. And the federal government did not stop that from happening. Racism and greed were behind the scenes of it the whole time. And just because the Cherokee were native, just because the Cherokee weren't white, they didn't have the political power during the time. So even if they followed the law, they were pushed aside. And that just goes ahead and shows us how the Constitution gave privilege to some people and denied it to others, depending on their race and power at the time. This is leading us to the question, what does this teach us? And let's go ahead and keep in mind when answering this question that the court protected Georgia's control and not Cherokee's rights as people. Let's go ahead and now delve into the laws built on injustice and how the Constitution failed the Cherokee. The Constitution was supposed to be about fairness and justice, but this case shows us that those things are only applied if you have one thing, and that's power. The Cherokee had treaties. They followed the law within the U.S., but the people in charge and above them decided not to protect them. That's why this case is such a big example of how the Constitution failed many Native nations and contributed to so many generations of trauma. It gave a framework of justice, but it didn't actually deliver it when race, class, and land were involved. Now let's go ahead and talk about the aftermath and also the Trail of Tears. So even though we know that this case was now dismissed, the issue didn't go away. In a separate case called in Worcester versus Georgia, the court said that states like Georgia could not interfere with Native nations. But as mentioned in the Supreme Court Historical Society article, President Andrew Jackson at the time ignored the ruling. And that led to the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee were forced off of their own native land and were forced to march west. That just goes ahead and shows us how even when the court finally tried to do the right thing, other parts of government do not care, and the system completely failed them as a result. Let's go ahead and wrap this up and talk about the broader historical impact that this case has made today. This case matters so much because it shows us how laws and institutions such as the court and the Constitution were used to protect power and privilege, not fairness. Native people contributed so much to the development of our country, and they had governments, relationships with the U.S., and their own indigenous cultures, but besides that fact, they were still treated like they didn't belong. This is when it comes down to the answer to that, and it was about how the Constitution and the judicial system were focused about race and class. And that goes ahead and helps explain how people in power shaped who had rights at the time and who didn't. And it was all the way through the Reconstruction of America. When connecting everything today, these problems didn't just end in the 1800s. Native communities still have to fight for sovereignty and land. Our legal systems still reflect power structures, and this case helps us show how race and privilege shaped justice back then and still do now. Nonetheless, from this case set aside, it makes me think about how my own understanding of fairness and how it's shaped by history. I feel like we just can't assume that the Constitution automatically protects everyone, and it depends on who is in power and whether they choose to actually live up to those promises. Thank you for listening.